Good morning, everyone. I am Pramati Bhargav from Eklavya Club, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all for another insightful session of our NET lecture series. Our speaker for today is someone who probably doesn't even need an introduction here, Mr. Prince Raghuvanshi. Most of us are familiar with him and his dedication towards English literature. He is currently pursuing masters from our institute and has recently cleared NET. We are glad to have you with us, Bhaiya.
Thank you, Pramiti, for the introduction. And I kind of missed out on the important things, but yeah, let's get it started. So now, let us begin with the topic that we have on our hand, that is African literature. Now, from the very beginning, African literature was based much on the history and traditions that were passed down the centuries orally rather than verbally or in the form of words. So most of African literature wasn't written per se, but it was more told by the folk tales, the songs that passed on with the culture over the years in different parts of Africa, the Kenyan culture, the Ghanaian culture, the Nigerian culture, and all that. Because Africa was mostly a tribal region, more of a tribal continent, and therefore a lot of literature that has been observed in Africa was related more to the oral traditions. And when we move on, see, here's also a term called orature. So now this orature, this term, it was given by Pau Zirimu. Now Pau Zirimu gave this term orature, and Pau Zirimu was from Uganda. Now orature relates to the oral traditions of Africa, of the Aboriginal or the original tribes and their literature, which includes the songs and the stories and the calls. Calls especially because initially what used to happen, when the tribal people used to tell the story, they used to use something that was called as the call and response theory. Now, the call and response theory is like one person tells a story and the other character is working in response to the main character. And therefore, it is a way of telling a story. Now, what are the key characteristics of African literature? Let me just quickly brush through it. The first one is cultural diversity. Now, as we know, there are a lot of tribes and a lot of different ethnicities throughout Africa, and therefore the entire literature is focused more on encompassing and preserving these variations, these cultures, these perspectives. And the diversity can be seen in the regional languages, the indigenous languages of the tribes, and the portrayal of their ethnic experiences and cultures. Historical and political engagement. So, after the colonization, because this comes frequently under the post-colonial literature, and it's not separately mentioned as African literature. Post-colonial experience of the Black culture and the African culture in particular is what makes them very different, very distinct from other cultures around the world, and it establishes their identity. So therefore, when we talk about African literature, we talk about their experiences with racism, with apartheid, and their struggle to preserve their own identity. Now, realism and symbolism. Symbolism, because African literature was more focused on the oral tongue, and it was more depicting the real ideas of the people. Therefore, realism is a very important part of African literature because it conveyed the real struggles, the real back and forth of the lives of the people that used to go through apartheid and racism on a daily basis. Now, community and individual identity. When we talk about community and individual identity, we'll talk about the different movements that will come later on in this presentation, that are the Harlem movement, Harlem Renaissance, or the one that we are about to talk about, that is the Negritude movement. So now literature helps to preserve the identity and the cultural and the communal identity of a person, as well as the personal identity. Now moving on, we have Negritude movement at our hand. So the Negritude movement, it started in 1930s in the Black intellectual writers and politicians of the French-speaking world. Actually, this movement started in the French colonies like Martinique or Senegal or French Guiana. These were the colonies that were already taken over by the French and now the black people, the African people settled in there, started to reclaim their ideas of African culture. Now, what happens when a colonial imperialism takes place in a particular colony or a country? The people out there, the natives, they start to lose their heritage, their culture, and their identity. This movement was actually an effort to preserve these identities and was to sideline the political domination of the French colonialism. And what you need to remember over here is the term was coined by I.E.H.E, who was from Martinique, and the main political or the main idea, the main prominent pioneers of this movement were Leopold Senghor, who were from Senegal, and Leon Gontran Damas from French Guiana, who was instrumental in articulating its philosophy. So now there are like three or four people that you need to remember whenever a question comes like that. Because I remember recently in NET 2024, there was a question relating to it, and it was asked which of the following was not related to the negritude movement. So these are the names that you particularly need to remember. And so, which are the main, the key texts when we talk about the negritude movement? Amos Isaiah's book, Kahir de on Retour of Paz Natal, which is actually the notebook of the return to the native land. And Leopold Senghor's poetry are the key texts. And one thing that you also need to remember that this was supported by the famous African critic Frantz Fanon. So Frantz Fanon, we'll talk about him later in the presentation. It also influenced other movements like the Black Consciousness movement, the Afrocentrism, and movements like the Harlem movement, the Jinde Vorobak movement in Australia, the Garrison mentality in Canada, the Harlem movement in America. All of these movements were basically to counter the alien culture. The alien culture is preserving your own identity, which is threatened by the apprehension of some other person, of some other culture or identity. Now, there's also a point mentioned by me, the talented 10. Now, the talented 10 was actually an idea given by Malcolm X. I hope you know who Malcolm X was. Malcolm X was actually an American philosopher, Black American philosopher and thinker. And he gave the idea of the talented 10, which said that out of all 10 black people, out of every 10 black people, there is always one genius or one talented person that comes out of that strata. This was the idea of the talented 10, if it ever comes into the exam. So it was given by Malcolm X. Now, the key figures of negritude movement, I.E.H.E. Now, I.E.H.E's influential work, as you've already read, The Return of the Natives or the Kahir de d'un Retour à Pays Natal. So, because, these terms are in French, it'll be a little hard to remember per se, but if you do remember that, any kind of French title comes into play in the question, you can somehow relate it to the negritude movement pioneers. Leopold Senghor, he has written works like Chants de Ombre, which celebrated African culture and philosophy, and he was the poet and first president of independent Senegal. Senegal is actually a country which was formerly a French colony in Africa. Then we have Leon Gontran Damas. So his works are Pigments, which was critical in the movement. It emphasized the realities of racial injustice that prevailed in Africa. Characteristics, again, culture and affirmation. It was made to preserve the African culture in the veil of the French colonialism, and it also emphasized on the black pride or the pride of the black or African heritage and the traditions. Now, anti-colonial sentiment. The entire ideas of these plays, these entire movements were to kind of oppose the sentiments that were colonial back then. The colonial powers, the colonial imperial powers of the French, the British, all these entities work in the opposition of the native culture of Africa, and therefore it was to oppose these. Now, literary expression, again, because literature is a vessel for ideas, and therefore through poetry, essays, and other literary forms, they started to celebrate the African aesthetics, the oral tradition that came from Africa, the rhythms, Africa is very famous for rhythm, as you might know, because there are a lot of even instruments that relate to rhythm from Africa. Pan Africanism. Now, this was not just related to a particular country in Africa, but it related to the entire continent, the entire African diaspora. Moving on, we have the Harlem Renaissance. Now, this isn't particularly African per se, but it relates to Africa in the term that it was influenced by African identity and the African culture. Now, Harlem Renaissance, Harlem, as you might know, is a place in New York, in America. The term Harlem was coined by Alain Locke, and it was popularized by writers such as Langston Hughes. And it started in Africa, and there was, a majority African colony in Africa, in America, called Harlem. So a lot of black people settled there, and they started to celebrate their identity, and they started to reaffirm their identity as, a cultural minority in Africa. Now, the authors that relate to it are primarily Langston Hughes. So he has a couple of poems that you need to remember. I Too Sing America, which was based on Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, and the poem The Negro Speaks of the River, and the play Mulatto, A Tragedy of the Deep South. Now, mulatto is actually a word, it's a sort of like a racist word that is given to the women of African descent. And the first novel that he put out was Not Without Laughter. And there was this poetry collection called Let America Be Great Again. Okay. So then again, when we talk about this, we'll move on further to his work that is called A Note on Commercial Theatre. It was kind of like a guide on how black theatre should operate and what they should talk about. Then we have, the main definition of Harlem movement. The entire idea of it was that the blacks were forced to move from the south, from where they were initially settled, to the north, where it was cold. And therefore, it was also called the New Negro Movement. And the title first appears in Alain Locke's anthology, The New Negro by Alain Locke in 1925. Moving on. Now we have a couple of other terms that relate to African literature. We have already talked about orature. Now we'll talk about the stranger king theory. Now, this idea was given by Marshall Saleh. It states that we fear what we do not know about, the fear of the unknown, and therefore we accept it more as supreme to what we already know. Now, this was given in context to the ideas of white supremacy by the people of Africa. The people of Africa, they thought that the white people were an alien power, and therefore, because of their, unbeknownst to them, they thought that these people might be more powerful than what we already are, and therefore we must accept this supremacy over us. And therefore, the stranger became more powerful and eventually became the oppressor of the native. Then there was another term which was called the Jim Crow Law. Now, the Jim Crow Law was the Black Civil Code. It was essentially a segregationist code. Segregationist that separates the whites from the black, and it prevented the blacks from using the public amenities that were only preserved for the whites. These public amenities were only reserved for the whites, and if in case the blacks used these, they were punished and penalized for that. Now, then we have another term which is black womanism. It's a social political term, a literary framework that talks about the experiences, the struggles of, and the contributions of the black women particularly. Now, it's very much similar to feminism, and the term was given and popularized by Alice Walker in her 1983 collection In Search of Her Mother's Gardens. It was a womanist poet, and the term womanism talks about the mainstream feminism, particularly the history and the marginalization of black women and other women of culture. So something that you need to remember is the term black womanism was coined by Alice Walker in 1983 in collection In Search of Her Mother's Garden. Okay. Now, themes, I don't think we need to talk about these much because negative movement already covered these. But yeah, social justice, inequality, apartheid, racial identity, the heritage, the pride, tradition versus modernity, diaspora. All of these ideas are related deeply to African literature. Moving to our first writer, I think the most prominent of all the native African writers is Mr. Chinua Achebe. Now, born in 1930 in Ogidi, Nigeria, he studied in history, theology, in the University of Ibadan, and then he worked as a broadcaster in the Nigerian Broadcasting Corporation. And he gained acclaim for his novels that depicted the African culture and the tribes and the effects of colonialism on the African culture. We'll talk about a couple of his works. Now, I've mentioned almost all of the works, or at least the more primary works of Mr. Achebe, as you can see. And I've talked about in detail about some of his works, so you can remember the chronology in order for you to remember, in case an answer which is chronological comes into the exam. This is something that you need to remember: the dates, the years of the work, and the names of the work, in case a question is asked. Even in the match the following, that you need to match the name of the work with the writer, and therefore you'll need to remember these. Now, actually, there is a lot of curveballs that are thrown in net these days, because you cannot particularly bet on a certain thing that this will come in the exam relating to African culture. But I've tried to cover all the stones, and right now it's 12 already. But I think we'll extend the lecture to a bit more, because of the technical difficulties that we faced earlier. So pardon me for that. Now, the first work that he has written, the most prominent work that Achebe has written, is Things Fall Apart. And again, I think a lot of people might know about this. It was his debut novel, and it is considered a classic of modern African literature. Now, this talks about the tribe of the Igbo tribe of Umofia. It was a village in Nigeria. So the main character here is Okonkwo. He's a prominent leader. He's probably the symbol of the masculine identity, and he opposes traditional value of the tribes of his village. So now what happens is, whenever his masculinity is questioned, he feels kind of weak, and even to prove his identity, he kills his own adopted son. And Now later, what happens is, when he kills his own son, what he ends up shooting the son of the tribe leader of the village, and it makes him go away on an exile from the village. And when he returns to the village, he sees that the colonial powers, the British powers, have already taken over his village, and even his son, he has accepted Christianity and other cultures. So basically, this novel depicts how colonialism, it plunders and it destroys it. It decimates the traditional native culture of these lands of Africa. Then we have No Longer at Ease. It is actually kind of like a sequel to Things Fall Apart. And it follows the story of Obi Okonkwo, the real son, the grandson of Okonkwo from Things Fall Apart, as he struggles with corruption and cultural changes in Nigeria. And There are two things to remember over here, that now both of these novels, they have taken their titles from somewhere. And while Things Fall Apart, I would like to ask you all a question. Do you know from which novel does Things Fall Apart take its title? Which poem does Things Fall Apart take its title, and who was the writer of that poem? From which
The
poem?
Second Coming by W.B. Yeats.
Very good. Yes, exactly. The title was taken from The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. The line that stated, the gyre cannot hold, anarchy is unveiled upon the world, the center cannot hold, and things fall apart. So yes. And now the second novel, the sequel of Things Fall Apart, that is No Longer at Ease. No Longer at Ease takes its title from T.S. Eliot's poem, The Journey of the Magi. The Journey of the Magi actually talks about the biblical journey of the three Magi's that went on the search of the birth of the God, that is Christ. So that was a little fun fact that I threw around. And I think if you do remember, and if it comes in the exam, I think you'll be able to attempt it. Then we have Arrow of God. Arrow of God again talks about Ezulu. He was the chief priest of the country, and again, the normal things about the religious duties and the effect of the Britishers, the colonial culture on the identity of the African culture. It was set in the 1920s under the British administration, and even the son of the chief priest of the village becomes a Christian. So it becomes kind of like the polarizing views of the son and the father are displayed in the poem, in the novel. Now, what other works has he written? The Arrow of God. Yes. So, Arrow of God was the one that we were talking about currently. Arrow of God examines the impact of colonialism on Christianity on the people of Africa. And The Man of People was a satirical novel. Then The Anthills of Savannah is actually a story of three friends who deal with the corruption in the particular areas of Africa. There's a politician who stops the writer, the journalist, from posting anything negative about him, and eventually then he is killed. So here are the characters: Chris Orico, who was commissioner, then Beatrice Oko, the finance minister, and Ikem Osodi. So Ikem Osodi was the newspaper editor who was actually ordered to kill by the finance minister Beatrice Oko. Now, there are other works, A Man of People and Alice we have already discussed it. And he also wrote several collection of short stories and children's book. It was named by How the Leopard Got His Claws. And then Beware Soul Brother and Christmas in Biafra. Biafra is an area in Nigeria. So now we'll move on to next writer, but there's something that you need to remember is his awards. Achebe won the Booker International Prize, Man Booker International Prize in 2007. That is something you need to remember if it ever comes in the exam. Moving on, we have Louis Nkosi. Louis Nkosi was a South African writer. He was born in Durban, and he wrote about the apartheid that prevailed in Africa. He worked in other countries like UK, USA, Switzerland, and his literary style combined the social critique and the innovative narrative style. Now, his popular works are Mating Birds, that was written in 1986, and it talks about the forbidden love and the racial prejudice that prevailed in apartheid era. And in this novel, there's a man called Indy Sibia. He was accused of raping a white woman, Veronica Slater, and it uses the flashback techniques to experience explain the complex dynamics of desire, power, the societal taboos that are prevailing in Africa. And we have Underground People. It follows the story of Cornelius Malopo, a teacher who turned revolutionary against the anti-apartheid struggle. Then we have an important novel that we have here is Mandela's Ego. So Mandela's Ego, it was published in 2006, and it is the story of a man who actually has his psychosexual desires connected to Nelson Mandela. He was very much inspired by Nelson Mandela's ideas of black is beautiful, or we should celebrate the black identity, that he connects his own sexual identity and his charm with Mandela. So whenever Mandela is in prison, this particular guy, he cannot feel any kind of energy within himself, any kind of affectionate energy within himself. So it's like a satirical exploration of the political ideas and human imperfection. So in any case, if there is a question about this psychosexual analysis or psychosexual desires are mentioned in which novel, then you can write Mandela's Ego. Then we have a couple of critical works like Home in Exile and The Transplanted Heart. Achievements: he won the Newman Fellowship Award at Harvard in 1961, and he has also been nominated for prestigious award, which include the Commonwealth Prize. Enough for that. Now we have Mr. Frantz Fanon. The Frantz Fanon, again, the person who supported the negritude movement. He was actually more of a critic, a philosopher, a psychiatrist than a writer. His work was mainly prose, and he was born in 1925 in Martinique. Martinique, as I've already told you, was a French colony of Africa, and his work was deeply psychological and sociological, and talked about the effect of colonialism on the people. So Fanon worked in Algeria during the Algerian War, and he has wrote about that as well. His popular works are Black Skin and White Masks. Now, it talks about the impact of racism and colonialism. It says that the internalization of inferiority among the black individual is very prevalent. So, when we try to adopt a different race, generally what happens is when a particular culture is suppressed, particularly a black culture, we try to adopt the methods of our oppressors. Let's say, in case of India, let's say, for example, we try to adopt English as the main language of our conversation. There is no particular language in a country, but we use English to a great extent. So it is kind of like an internalization of the oppression that we face. And in the similar way, Fanon talks about that the self perception that is caused by the systematic racism leads to people adopting and assimilating into the culture of their oppressor. Then we have Wretched Earth. It talks about now this Wretched Earth is actually a work which is exactly the polar opposites of the ideas of Gandhi. He talks that in order for us to gain independence, in order for us to gain revolution, in order for us to overthrow the the colonizers, we must work with violence, with the help of violence, to throw away the violent measures of the people. Mr. Fanon does not believe in the ideas of satyagraha or non-violence. He advocates for the use of violence in his work. And toward African revolution, then again, toward African. Wait a minute. Yes, here we are. Toward African revolution, again, it's a compilation of essays on liberation and decolonization, and it talks about the political, cultural, social aspects of decolonization. His achievements, Mr. Fanon has talked about a lot of the racial apartheid, the racial identity, and the decolonization movement and liberation movement are inspired from his works in Africa, Latin America, and Asia as well. He contributed to psychiatry as well and the psychological effects of oppression. Another work that he had written is The Dying Colonism. It was based on the Algerian War of Independence, and it talks about the struggle for liberation in Algeria transformed the societal structures and how the gender dynamics were pursued perceived in the Algerian culture. And it also talked about the resilience and the strength of the Algerian culture. Then we have at her hand Miss Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She was actually a rather modern African writer, a female writer, who talks a lot about the feminist cultures of the African side. So she grew up in Suka, and then she went to the United States. She went to live in Connecticut, and she studied in Hopkins University, and she got a degree in African Studies at Yale University. Now, she has written a couple of works like Purple Hibiscus and Half of the Yellow Sun. These are two of her most important works in novels, two of her most important novels. The first one won the Commonwealth Prize, and the second one was the Orange Prize. And then we also have a TED Talk by her, why we should all be feminist, and it was published as an essay, and then it talked about the cry for contemporary feminism. Now, Purple Hibiscus talks about a 15-year-old girl, Kambili, who explores the anti-feminist and anti-freedom, liberation ideas in her family. And then when she went on to grow out of the experiences of her oppressing father, she went to her aunt Ilifoma, who gave her a new vent out in her life, and then she liberated herself from the religious fanatism and the clash between the traditional and the modern values in a Nigerian society. Now, it won the Commonwealth Prize for the best book in 2005. That is what you need to remember. Then we have Half of the Yellow Sun. It talks about the university professor Olana, who was the daughter of the Nigerian businessman, and who was an expatriate British. And through experiences, she talks about the culture of the Nigerian society, and she delves into the themes of love, betrayal, and struggle for independence. Now, other works include Americana. Americana is actually kind of like a vlog of a sort that she did, and it centers about the struggles of a Nigerian woman who lives and studies in the United States. So it's like a blog. Then we have her feminist works like We Should All Be Feminist, and it was Adichie's Notes on Grief. So these were the prose works that were written by her in essays. She has won the MacArthur Fellowship. That is one of her main, one of her main achievements. Then we have Mr. Wo Soyinka. Wo Soyinka was a Nigerian playwright, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1986. That is something that you will need to, remember always. Mr. Wallace Soyinka. He studied in the same university as Mr. Chinua Achebe, the Ibadan University, and he has worked for the liberation of the Nigerians and human rights. His main works are The Swamp Dwellers, The Lion and the Jewel, and Conji's Harvest. Now, these are three of his main works in terms of novels. The Lion and the Jewel, it talks about the fight between the lions. There are two people, Boroka and the modern guy who was Lakunle, and these two people fight over the right over Sidi, who was actually a woman. So now Sidi goes from Boroka to Lakunle, and Sidi is actually the symbolic jewel in the poem, and the lions are Boroka and Lakunle. And then we have Konji's Harvest. Konji's Harvest is about the power and position. So Konji is the leader of Ibandola, and now Seji again. Then similar themes are over here. The Seji goes from Danola to Konji. Danola was the older person. Konji was the new person, similar to the Lion and June. Then you can read all these works that were written by him, and the years as well. Now, poetry, some of his most important poems are Mandela's Earth and Other Poems, and Telephone Conversation, that I'll talk about later in this work. Prose, The Man Died, the prison notes that he wrote from the prison. It was written in 1972, and it talks about his experiences while he was in prison. Telephone Conversation is actually a poem that talks about the ideas of racism. Now, this is a poem that has a story in which a black guy calls a white woman, and he says that he wants to rent a home, rent a room, and the woman, she is very much obsessed with the ideas of the guy being black. So now initially when he does not tell her that he is black, and then he tells her that he is black, so she talks about her his color and his race to great extent. She even talks about what kind of black are you. Are you the chocolate black, or are you the lesser kind of black. So now, this talks about how the undertones of racism are prevalent in the white society, and it talks about the irony that and the ignorance of the white people and about the black culture and identity. Achievements: he won the Nobel Prize in 1986. That is something that you need to remember. And he has worked for the human rights in Africa. Nadine Gordimer, again, Nadine Gordimer was a political activist in South Africa. And what you need to remember is that she won the Nobel Prize in 1991. So 1986, Mr. Wole Soyinka, 1991, Miss Nadine Gordimer, and then we have someone on the next slide who was J.M. Coetzee. Jim Coetzee won the Nobel Prize in 2003. So Nadine Gordimer, she lived in the small mining town near Johannesburg, and she started writing at the age of 15. And she used to challenge the apartheid system that prevailed in Africa, and a lot of her books were banned due to this. Some of her most popular works are The Lying Days, that she wrote in 1953, The World of Strangers. It talks about the racial tensions, and The World of Strangers is actually talks about the this life of Toby and his friend Simon. The Lying Days was the first novel of Nadine Gordimer. It explores the coming of age of a young white woman in South Africa. Then we have Burger's Daughter. Burger's Daughter, we'll talk about a couple of her works. Now, The Lying Days is actually the coming of age novel set in Africa. It talks about the story of Helen Shaw, a young white woman who grows up in a small mining town, and she moves to University of Johannesburg. So she talks about the harsh realities of the racial segregation and the injustices that prevailed in South Africa. And as she becomes more aware of the situation around her, she becomes more of a revolutionary and more of a pioneer for the societal change. Then we have Julie's People. Julie is actually it's a dystopian work where Julie is is a worker, a black worker, a black servant in a white liberal family, and here the power dynamics shift, and the people are dependent on Julie for survival. So it's like a dystopian novel, which is a little bit unrealistic, but then it talks about the dependency of the different races on each other. Then we have Berger's Daughter. Berger's Daughter talks about the story of Rosa Berger. Rosa Berger is actually a woman whose father was a big revolutionary, who was a big social worker. But what happens is Miss Rosa actually wants to establish her own identity, and she works years and years to in order to establish her own identity. But eventually, what happens is that people recognize someone after a couple of years recognizes her as the daughter of Mr. Berger. So now that is why the title of the novel is Berger's Daughter. Achievements, again, she has won the Nobel Prize in 1991 and the Booker Prize in 1974. Mariam Ba. So Mariam Ba is actually a Senegalese author. Senegal, which was a French colony, she talks about the feminist side of African literature. She talks about gender inequality, social injustice, the polygamy that prevailed in the African society. She won the Noma Award for publishing in Africa, and she talks about women's education. And her work is often studied in feminist literary criticism as well. So there are two works that we are going to talk about here. So Long a Letter, that Unisri Long Lettre, that was written in 1971. It is an epistolary work. Now, epistolary work is a kind of work that is written in the form of letters. So when you write a letter to someone or referring to someone, it's called epistolary work. And this kind of form of literature developed in the 1500s in particular. And because of this work, she won the Noma Award for publishing in Africa. It talks about the themes of polygamy, widowhood, women's identity, all that. Then we have Scarlet's Song, Un Chant de Ecalarte. So it was published after her death posthumously, and it talks about the challenges of the cross-cultural marriages and the racial prejudice that exist in a society. The relationship between a Senegalese man and a French woman. So, there is a cross-cultural association that exists in these works. And then we have Mr. J.M. Coetzee. So, J.M. Coetzee was a South African-born novelist, and he won the Nobel Prize in 2003. So, in 1986, Mr. Wole Soyinka. In 1991, Ms. Nadine Gordimer. And then in 2003, J.M. Coetzee. These are the three African writers that have won Nobel Prizes. So he was born in 1914 Cape Town, and some of his most important works, I think, there's one was in our course as well. It was called Disgrace. We'll talk about that later. So these are the the entire chronology of his works. He has written a trilogy. I don't remember the name of the particular trilogy, but if I do remember, I'll look it up and send it to you. The last three works that he has written relate to that trilogy: the childhood of Jesus, the school days of Jesus, and the death of Jesus. So these are the particular works, and Dustland is his debut novel. Some of his most important works include Disgrace. So it talks about the life of David Lurie, who was the middle-aged professor in post-apartheid South Africa. So he becomes embroiled in a scandal, and he goes back to the farm in the countryside to his daughter, and then the racial tensions around that area also talks about also relate to and also affect his personal life and his relation with his daughter. So it's a beautiful work. Then his literary achievement, then again he has won the literary Nobel Prize in 2003, and Jim Coetzee also won the Booker Prize in two separate times in 1983 and 1999. Then we have Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o was born in Kenya. He has worked for a great extent for the liberation of Kenya, and he has written in both English and Gikuyu. Gikuyu is the regional language of Kenya. So his first novel was Weep Not Child, which was the first major novel by an African man. And he writes in the Bantu language of the Kikuyu people of Kenya. In the first novel, Weep Not Child, he explores the Mau Mau uprising and the Kenyan society. So, the award-winning novel "Weep Not Child" is the story of Kikuyu family that was drawn into the struggle. Then we have "A Grain of Wheat" and "The River Between." Then again, it talks about the social rebellion. So, two of his novels, "Weep Not Child" and "Grain of Wheat," talk about the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. Then we have Petals of Blood. It's a critique of the post-colonial Kenyan society and disillusion and corruption. Then we have Matagiri. Matagiri talks about the justice and truth in Kenya. His achievements, he was a big post-colonial activist, political activist, and literary awards. He has won Nonino International Literature Prize. Then we have Mr. I.E.H.E. I.E.H.E. was a Ghanaian novelist. So we have covered South African novelists, we have covered Kenyan novelists, we have covered Nigerian novelists. We are now covering a Ghanaian novelist as well. We have also covered a Senegalese novelist and the French African writers as well. So he talked about the corruption and materialism in Africa. He's known to explore the neo-colonialism and colonialism identities in Africa. And he talks about spirit and substance, and the spirit more than the materialism in Africa. His most famous work is "The Beautiful Ones Are Not Born Yet." It was his debut novel, and it shows the moral corruption and political corruption in Ghana, and he shows the deep concern for the progeny, the posterity that is about to come in Africa. Fragments is a collection of essays that addresses the African society and its challenges, and it talks about the opposition of the Western inspired materialism or the capitalism in Africa. 2000 season talks about the pre-colonial times in Africa, and then we have the eloquence of the scribes. It talks about the African leadership and traditional values. Then we have Mr. Nuruddin Farah. So now Nuruddin Farah is actually someone who was related to India as well. He did his degree from Punjab University. He was although born in Somaliland, which is famous for the pirates as well. So he blends the modernist technique and African oral literature. So his most famous work is "From a Crooked Rib," that was published in 1917, and it talks about the oppression of the women in Somali society. So it's a story of Ebla who flees from her marriage, and then she struggles to find her own identity, and then she goes to another man who pushes her into prostitution, and therefore it's a story about a woman who has been oppressed throughout her life. Then we have Sweet and Sour Milk. It talks about the authoritarianism. It focuses on the life of a man named Loyan and the death of his twin brother Soyan, who was anti-government activist. So he goes into discovery of the death of his twin brother, and he unveils the corruption that prevailed in the society, the dictatorship. Then we have Sardines. Talks about the women's struggle again. Then there are a couple of his works, The Close Sesame, Maps, Gifts, Secret Links, all that. You can read these works. You need to remember the chronology of these works. And if there is a question that who wrote the Blood in the Sun trilogy, then we have here Mr. Nuruddin Farah, who has written the Blood in the Sun trilogy. And what are the three novels that come under this trilogy? Sweet and Sour Milk, Sardines, and Closed Sesame. Okay, now moving on to his achievements, he won the Nushat International Prize in Literature. Then we have Mr. Ben Okri. Ben Okri is actually a Nigerian and a British-born Nigerian writer who wrote poetries and essays. Now he is most famous for his work that uses the theme of magic realism. Magic realism, as you might know, that Salman Rushdie has used magic realism in his work. So he's a short story writer, and he talks about the social and political chaos in the country of his birth. Okay, so now some of his most famous works are Flowers and Shadows, and we'll talk about the first novel that is the first work that is over here is Flowers and Shadows and Landscape Within. So they depict the surrealistic images of the surrealistic image of Africa. Okay, so now flowers and novels, and then we have the Famished Road. Now the Famished Road is actually the novel that talks about the struggles of a person. There was this child called Azaro. So now, due to the magic realistic idea. Okay. So the ideas of magic realism is prevalent in this novel. It's the story of a child named Azaro, who is believed to be the spirit child, the Nebiku, who can talk to the spirits. So now there is this particular spirit who constantly bugs her, and then the hardships of his parents, and the influence of the political forces in the story are talked about in this work. So he won the Booker Prize in 1991 for Famished Road, and he has also been nominated for the Commonwealth Prize. Now, there are a couple of Afro American writers as well that I would like to talk about here. Now, these writers do not particularly relate to the the African diaspora, but these writers have influenced, the African culture in America as well as anywhere throughout the world. So some of these are white, most of these are black people, but they have they have been a cornerstone in the development of African culture throughout the world, and from America in particular. So the first one that we have over here is Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a lady. She was an American author, and she worked in the abolitionist movement in Africa. So she is known for her literary works that talked about the moral and political issues of slavery in Africa. Stowe's work talk about the climate of the 19th century, the 1800s, and back then, the racial apartheid, the racial identity, the segregationist ideas prevailed a lot in Africa. So, she is famous for because of her works like Uncle Tom's Cabin. So now her particular work, this novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, inspired it went on to spark the abolitionist movement in the northern United States, and which eventually led to the Civil War. So there's this famous quote by Abraham Lincoln that relates to Miss Harriet Beecher Stowe. He says that, so you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this war. So the book that we are talking about is actually Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is actually a novel that talks about a particular man named Uncle Tom who was a slave or a servant in a White House. So now these ideas are taken from Uncle Tom's Cabin, and when Lincoln and Stowe met, they discussed these ideas, and later these went on to spark a conversation within the United States against the racial segregationist ideas and led to Civil War. Now, some of her major works are Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was published in 1852. It is an anti-slavery novel, and it was a turning point in American culture. It talks about the dehumanization of the enslaved Africans, and it sold over 300,000 copies. And as I've already told you, it was a novel that led to the Great War, the Civil War. Then we have Dread, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp. It focuses on the struggle of the enslaved individuals, the ethical dilemmas faced by the abolitionists in the American culture. Then we have The Minister's Wooing. It explores the idea of New England. So New England is actually the area where the Protestants initially settled in America, and the Calvinism and impact on love, on morality. Then we have a couple of other works like Palmetto Leaves in 1873 and Old Town Folks. Now we are going to talk about Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston is an Afro-American again. She is again an Afro-American author, an anthropologist, a folklorist, and she worked closely with the Harlem Renaissance and the Negritude movement. She is also known to be a supporter of the Negritude movement. So she talks about again the racial identity as a woman in Africa, the gender identity, the heritage of African people. She is closely related to the blues music. There is a novel by her called The Blues People. So if there is a question relating to who propagated and advocated for blues music is actually the jazz music that we already know about, that later went on to become the current genre such as R&B and then hip hop. So and these were particularly black music that came from Black Africa. Blues music is called the black music in white Africa. She was an anthropologist, and she wrote about the African vernacular and the oral traditions of Africa. Okay, so now her particular works are Jonas Godwine. It was written in 1932. Mules and Men. It was again an anthropological work, and it collected American folk tales, the songs and taboos, the voodoo practices. Then we have Their Eyes of Watching God. So this is the most essential novel by her, The Eyes of Watching God. It talks about the themes of love, the independence and self-discovery through the protagonist named Jenny Crawford. So Jenny Crawford is actually the black woman who says that the eyes of the black people are watching God. They have seen God, and the God is seeing the oppression that the black people are facing. Then we have Moses, the man on the mountain. The man on the mountain, it reinterprets the story of Moses, who was the prophet, and it sees it through an African lens. It's quite similar to the story of Desdemona by Toni Morrison. So now Desdemona is a character from, as we know, Othello, and Desdemona is retold through an African lens, a racial lens. So these two are closely related. Then we have the Seraph of the Savannah. The Seraph of the Savannah talks about the white couple in Florida, and they're diverging from as they diverge from the African American narratives. Then we have Mr. Richard Wright. Richard Wright, he was a prominent African American writer who was known for the racial themes and social issues. Now, Mr. Chinua Achebe, Mr. Chinua Achebe has talked about great length about Mr. Richard Wright. Richard Wright, he says that Richard Wright's work, the native son, his native son has influenced the African writers to great extent. Mr. Chinua Achebe says that I see myself in the character of the native son. He sees himself in the character, the Bigger Thomas. Bigger Thomas is the main protagonist. So Chinua Achebe says that the struggle of Bigger Thomas is the representation, the reflection of the struggle of a lot of the African males. So his literature, it delves into the fiction and essays, and it criticizes the systematic racism and the psychological effects of oppression. So he was born in Mississippi. Mississippi is the main segregated South. The South was the primarily the areas of the black, and then they were pushed on to the North, which was rather cold. His major literary contributions is that he was a prominent figure in the civil rights movement and the African American literature. So his works talk about the lives of the African identity, the black individuals, and how they work against a racially prejudiced society. He passed away in 1960 in Paris. So some of his most famous works are Uncle Tom's Children, which was written in 1938, and it is a collection of novella which depicts the lives of African American in the segregated South, because Mr. Wright was the native resident of the segregated South, and it received the Guggenheim Fellowship and the critical acclaim for his bold themes. Then we have his most famous work, arguably the most remarkable work by Mr. Richard Wright, that is The Native Son. So The Native Son is a novel about Bigger Thomas, a young black man in Chicago. So what happens is Bigger Thomas, he leaves his home and he looks for a job in America. He's not, very educated. He eventually lands himself a job as a driver for a white family. And then what happens is he travels with a woman. He's a driver to a woman, a young woman of the family, who is quite the similar age as him. So one night, this woman goes to a party, and what happens is she gets drunk, and when she returns to the home, this man he drops her to her home, to her room. But this is it is prohibited for a black man to touch a white woman. So what eventually happens when someone is about to come in the room, and then the woman tries to force herself upon the black man, Mr. Biggest Thomas, and then what happens, in order, in the effort to keep her quiet, he shuts her mouth closed, and because of that she is unable to breathe, and eventually she passes away. And now Mr. Thomas is in trouble, and she flees, and goes about the entire country in order to free himself from the racial oppression that he was about to face because of intentionally or unintentionally murdering a white woman. So this was the story of the native son, and this is a novel that Mr. Chinua Achebe, the African writer, related to, and it received a critical and commercial success, and it became the first book by an African American writer to be selected in the Book of the Month Club. Then we have Black Boy. It is an autobiographical account of Wright's childhood years and it is identity as a black man, and it became the bestseller. The Outsider is a philosophical novel that talks about the existentialism and white man listen. Is a collection of essays. Okay, and Long Dream is a young black man's coming of age novel. Then we have Mr. Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka is actually the last novelist that we are going to talk about in this presentation. His works influenced the Black Arts movement, and he talks about the cultural themes of Africa. So there are a couple of works that he had written. His poetry collection is prefaced to 20 volumes. A side note, his debut poetry collection, it talks about the existential themes and personal reflection of the poem. Then we have the Dead Lecturer. It talks about the transition in poetry from normal person to a person who is now more politically aware. Then we have Black Magic. It talks about the black nationalism. Then we have plays, The Dutchman, The Slave, and Baptism and the Toilet. So The Dutchman is a one-act play addressing the racial tensions in America. It won the Obie Award. And then we have Slave. Again, the themes of racial injustice, revolution, violence are explored in there. Then we have two prose collections. The first one is Home, the Social Essays, which was written in 1966. So it talks about the culture, the politics, and the black identity in Africa. So now what happened recently was I noticed one thing. There was a question in the February the exam that occurred in June, July, the one before the re-exam. The original exam of NET June, July, it had questions that related to quotes that were given by famous African authors. So here are a couple of quotes that are given by African authors. Now, this is very uncertain as to whether it will come in the exam or it won't come in the exam. But I think if we read these quotes, we'll get a common idea of what these writers have written about. So Chinua Achebe wrote that until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So it basically talks about how the colonial mindset will always put itself over the others. So therefore, the lions, the African people, should have their own historians, their own culture, in order for them to subjugate, or in order for them to rise over the colonial culture. And then we have this quote that every generation must recognize and embrace the task. It is peculiarly designed by the history and by providence to perform. Then we have Mr. Ngugi wa Thiong'o. It says that language carries culture and culture carries literature and literature. So you can read all these quotes and make note of trying to remembering them at least. So yeah, this was the end of my presentation. Now I would like to leave you on the note that it is very uncertain as to what will come in reference to African literature in UGC NET. There's a wide array of questions and topics that can be asked, because there is no particular things such as African literature, but more so post-colonial literature. So yes, I think there's a lot of content that you can explore here in this in this particular presentation, and I'll leave the PDF in the group as well for you to read and practice. Okay. So, yes, I will leave you on that note. Thank you.
Now, on behalf of all the attendees of the meeting, I'd like to thank Mr. Prince Raghuvanshi for your captivating lecture on African literature. The explanations that were given by you were truly enlightening, and your thoughtful analysis and coverage of most of the subtopics, as well as the authors, were really helpful and easy to grasp. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and broadening our understanding of the African literature. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Javeria. Thank you, all of you, for joining the lecture.